SPOOK by Bruce Sterling, one of the grandfathers of cyberpunk. Originally published in the April 1983 issue of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, republished the following year in a French magazine simply called Fiction, the number 356 issue. It first appeared in a collection of the author's stories entitled Crystal Express in 1989. It was in a German publication in 1990 and shortly followed by Japanese and Romanian. In 2002, author and editor Gardner Dozois included it in his anthology called Supermen. Read by Daryl T. Smith II for my channel Quasar Spectra. Spook. The Spook was peeling off from orbit, headed for Washington, D.C., and it felt just great. The Spook twisted convulsively in his seat, grinning out the plexiglass at the cheery, red-hot glow of the shuttle's wind edges. Far below, the unnatural green of genetically altered forests showed the faint scars of old-time roads and fence lines. The Spook ran long, narrow, agile fingers through the roots of his short-cropped blue hair. He hadn't made groundfall in 10 months. Already, the cooped-up feeling of the orbiting Zybat series was peeling off cold and crisp like a snake's skin. The shuttle decelerated through Mach 4 with a faint, delicious shiver. The Spook twisted in his seat and turned a long, slanted green glance past the sleeping plutocrat in the seat beside him and at a woman across the aisle. She had that cool, starved, Zybatsery look and those hollow, vein-webby eyes. Looked like the gravity was giving her trouble already. She'd spent too much time floating along those low-grav Zybatsery axes of rotation. She'd pay for it when they made groundfall, when she'd have to shuffle all cute from waterbed to waterbed like helpless prey. The Spook looked down. His hands were making unconscious twitchy clawing motions in his lap. He picked them up and shook the tension out of them. Silly little hands. The forests of the Maryland Piedmont skinned by like green video. Washington and the DNA Recombo labs of Rockville, Maryland were 1,080 clean, ticking seconds away. He couldn't remember when he'd ever had so much fun. Inside his right ear, the computer whispered. The shuttle albatrossed down on the reinforced runway, and airport groundcraft foamed it cool. The Spook decamped, clutching his valise. A chopper was waiting for him from the private security apparat of the Replicon Corporation. While it flew him to Replicon's Rockville HQ, he had a drink, shuddering a little at the intuitive impact of the unspoken paradigms of the chopper's interior. The techniques he had learned in the Zybatsery espionage camp oozed up his hindbrain like psychotic flashbacks. Under the impact of gravity, fresh air, and plush upholstery, whole sections of his personality were decaying at once. He was as sweet and fluid as the heart of a rotting melon. This was fluidity, slick as grease, all right. Acting on intuition, he opened his valise, took a mechanical comb from a grooming case, and flicked it on with the iridescent nail of his right thumb. Black dye from the comb's vibrating teeth soothed and darkened his blue Zybatsery coif. He unplugged the tiny jack that was coupled to the auditory nerve of his right ear and unclipped his computer earring. Humming to himself to cover the gaps in its whispering, he opened a flat case clipped inside the valise and restored the Minicomp earring to its own padded socket. Inside the case were 7 others, little jeweled globes packed with micro-miniature circuitry, soaked tight with advanced software. He plugged in a new one and hung it from his pale, pierced lobe. It whispered to him about his capabilities in case he had forgotten. He listened with half an ear. The chopper landed on the Replicon emblem on the rooftop pad of the 4-story apparat headquarters. The spook walked to the elevator. He nibbled a bit of skin from the corner of his nail and flicked it into the recessed slot of a biopsy analyzer, then rocked back and forth on his clean new heels, grinning as he was weighed and scanned and measured by cameras and sonar. The elevator door slid open. He stepped inside, staring ahead easily, happy as a shadow. It opened again, and he walked down a richly paneled hall and into the office suite of the head of Replicon Security. He gave his credentials to the secretary and stood rocking on his heels while the young man fed them through his desktop computer. The spook blinked his narrow green eyes. The corporate muzak was soaking into him like a hot bath. Inside, the security chief was all iron-gray hair and tanned wrinkles and big ceramic teeth. The spook took a seat and went limp as wax as the man's vibrations poured over him. The man bubbled over with ambition and corruption like a rusting barrel full of chemical waste. "Welcome to Rockville, Eugene." "Thank you, sir," the spook said. He sat up straighter, taking on the man's predatory coloration. "It's a pleasure." The security chief looked idly into a hooded data screen. "You come highly recommended, Eugene. I have data here on 2 of your operations for other members of the synthesis. In the Amsterdam Guild piracy case, you stood up under pressure that would have broken a normal operative." "I was at the head of my class," said the spook, smiling guilelessly. He didn't remember anything about the Amsterdam case. It had all slicked aside, erased by the veil. The spook looked placidly at a Japanese kakemono wall hanging. "We here at Replicon don't often enlist the help of your Zaibatsery apparat," the chief said. "But our cartel has been allotted a very special operation by the Synthesis Coordinating Board. Although you're not a member of the Synthesis, your advanced Zaibatsery training is crucial to the mission's success." The spook smiled blandly, waving the toe of his decorated shoe. Talk of loyalties and ideologies bored him. He cared very little about the Synthesis and its ambitious efforts to unite the planet under one cybernetic economic web. Even his feelings about his native Zaibatseries were not so much patriotism as the sort of warm regard that a worm feels for the core of an apple. He waited for the man to come to the point, knowing that his earring computer could replay the conversation if he missed anything. The chief toyed with an electronic stylus, leaning back in his chair. "It hasn't been easy for us," he said, "facing the ferment of the post-industrial years, watching a relentless brain drain into the orbital factories while overpopulation and pollution wrecked the planet. Now we find we can't even put the pieces back together without help from your orbiters. You can appreciate our position, I hope." "Perfectly," said the spook. Using his Zaibatsery training and the advantages of the veil, it wasn't hard at all to put on the man's skin and see through his eyes. He didn't like it much, but it wasn't difficult. "Things are settling down now, since most of the craziest groups have killed themselves off or emigrated into space. The Earth cannot afford the cultural variety you have in your orbiting city-states. Earth must unite its remaining resources under the Synthesis aegis. The conventional wars are over for good and all. What we face now is a war of states of mind." The chief began doodling absently with the light pen on a convenient video screen. "It's one thing to deal with criminal groups like the Guild Pirates, and another entirely to confront those, cults and sects who refuse outright to join the Synthesis. Since the population diebacks of the 2000s, large sections of the undeveloped world have gone to seed. This is especially true of Central America, south of the People's Republic of Mexico. It's there that we face a dissident cult calling itself the Maya Resurgence. We synthetics are confronting a cultural mindset, what your apparat, Eugene, would call a paradigm, that is directly opposed to everything that unites the synthesis. If we can stop this group before it can solidify, all will be well. But if their influence continues to spread, it may provoke militancy among the synthesis. And if we're forced to resort to arms, our own fragile concordance will come apart at the seams. We can't afford to remilitarize, Eugene. We can't afford those suspicions. We need everything we have left to continue to fight ecological disaster. The seas are still rising. The spook nodded. You want me to destabilize them, make their paradigm untenable, provoke the kind of cognitive dissonance that will cause them to crumble from within. Yes, the chief said. You are a proven agent. Tear them apart. The spook said delicately, if I find it necessary to use interdicted weapons. The chief paled, but set his teeth and said bravely, Replicon must not be implicated. It took 4 days for the small solar-powered Zeppelin to float and whir its way from the dikes of Washington, D.C. to the bloated Gulf of Honduras. The spook rode alone on a sealed flight. He spent most of the trip in a semi-paralyzed state, with the constant whisper of his computer taking the place of conscious thought. At last, the Zepp's programming brought it to a grayish, waterlogged section of wave-lapped tropical forest near the dock of New Belize. The spook had himself lowered by cable to a firm patch by the churned-up earth of the docks. He waved cheerily to the crew of a 3-masted schooner, who had been disturbed from their afternoon siesta by his almost silent arrival. It was good to see people again. 4 days with only his fragmentary self for company had left the spook antsy and hungry for companionship. It was suffocatingly hot. Wooden crates of bananas were ripening odoriferously on the dock. New Belize was a sad little town. Its progenitor, Old Belize, was underwater somewhere miles out in the Caribbean, and New Belize had been hastily cobbled together from leftovers. The center of the town was one of the prefabricated geodomes the synthesis used for headquarters in its corporate concessions. The rest of the town, even the church, clung to the dome's rim like the huts of villagers around a medieval fortress. When and if the seas rose farther, the dome would move easily, and the native structures would drown with the rest. Except for its dogs and flies, the town slept. The spook picked his way through the mud to a bumpy street of corduroyed driftwood. An Amerindian woman in a filthy shawl watched him from her butcher's stall beside one of the dome's airlocks. She brushed flies from a suspended pig's carcass with a palm leaf fan, and as his eyes locked with hers, he felt a paradigmatic flash of her numb misery and ignorance, like stepping on an electric eel. It was weird and intense and new, and her stupefied pain meant absolutely nothing to him except for its novelty. In fact, he could barely stop himself from leaping over her dirty counter and embracing her. He wanted to slide his hands up under her long cotton blouse and slip his tongue into her wrinkled mouth. He wanted to get right under her skin and peel it off like a snake's. Wow. He shook himself and went in through the airlock. Inside, it smelled of the synthesis, compressed and tangy like the air in a diving bell. It was not a large dome, but not a lot of room was needed for the modern management of information. The dome's lower floor was loosely divided into working offices with the usual keyboards, voice decoders, translators, video screens, and comm channels for satellites and electric mail. The personnel ate and slept upstairs. In this particular station, most of them were Japanese. The spook mopped sweat from his forehead and asked a secretary in Japanese where he might find Dr. Emilio Flores. Flores ran a semi-independent health clinic that had slipped suspiciously from synthetic control. The spook was forced to take a seat in the doctor's waiting room where he played antique video games on a battered old display screen. Flores had an endless clientele of the lame, halt, diseased, and rotting. These Belizeans seemed bewildered by the dome and moved tentatively, as if afraid that they might break the walls or floor. The spook found them intensely interesting. He studied their infirmities, mostly skin diseases, fevers, and parasitic infestations, with a sprinkling of septic wounds and fractures, with an analytic eye. He had never before seen people so sick. He tried to charm them with his expertise on the video games, but they preferred to murmur to one another in English patois or sit huddled and shivering in the air conditioning. At last the spook was allowed to see the doctor. Flores was a short, balding Hispanic, wearing a physician's traditional white business suit. He looked the spook up and down. "Oh," he said, "now your illness, young man, is one I have seen before. You want to travel into the interior?" "Yes," the spook said, "to Tikal. Have a seat." They sat down. Behind Flores's chair, a nuclear magnetic resonator sat ticking and blinking to itself. "Let me guess," the doctor said, steepling his fingers. "The world seems like a dead end to you, young man. You couldn't make the grade, or get the training to migrate to the Zybatseries, and you can't bear wasting your life cleaning up a world your ancestors ruined. You dread a life under the thumb of huge cartels and corporations that starve your soul to fill their pockets. You long for a simpler life, a life of the spirit." "Yes, sir." "I have the facilities here to change your hair and skin color. I can even arrange the supplies that will give you a decent chance of making it through the jungle. You have the money?" "Yes, sir. Bank of Zurich." The spook produced an electronic charge card. Flores fitted the card into a desktop slot, studied the readout, and nodded. "I won't deceive you, young man. Life among the Maya is harsh, especially at first. They will break you and remold you exactly as they want. This is a bitter land. Last century, this area fell into the hands of the predator saints. Some of the diseases the predators unleashed are still active here. The resurgence is heir to predator fanaticism. They, too, are killers." The spook shrugged. "I'm not afraid." "I hate killing," the doctor said. "Still, at least the Maya are honest about it, while the cost-benefit policies of the synthetics have made the entire local population into prey. The synthetics will not grant me funds of any kind to prolong the lives of so-called non-survival types, so I compromise my honor by accepting the money of synthetic defectors and finance my charities with treason. I am a Mexican national, but I learned my profession at a replicon university." The spook was surprised. He hadn't known there was still a Mexican nation. He wondered who owned its government. The preparations took 8 days. The clinic's machines, under Flores's token direction, tinted the spook's skin and irises and reworked the folds around his eyes. He was inoculated against the local and the artificially introduced strains of malaria, yellowjack, typhus, and dengue fever. New strains of bacteria were introduced into his gut to avoid dysentery, and he was given vaccines to prevent allergic reactions to the inevitable bites of ticks, fleas, chiggers, and, worst of all, burrowing screwworms. When the time came for him to bid farewell to the doctor, the spook was reduced to tears. As he mopped his eyes, he pressed hard against his left cheekbone. There was a clicking sound inside his head, and his left sinus cavity began to drain. He carefully but unobtrusively caught the draining fluid in his handkerchief. When he shook hands in farewell, he pressed the wet cloth against the bare skin of the doctor's wrist. He left the handkerchief on Flores's desk. By the time the spook and his mules had passed the cornfields and entered the jungle, the schizophrenic toxins had taken effect, and the doctor's mind had shattered like a dropped vase. The jungle of lowland Guatemala was not a happy place for an orbiter. It was a vast, canny morass of weeds run wild that had known man for a long time. In the 12th century, it had been cauterized for the irrigated cornfields of the original Maya. In the 20th and 21st, it had been introduced to the sinister logic of bulldozers, flamethrowers, defoliants, and pesticides. Each time, with the death of its oppressors, it had sprung back, nastier and more desperate than before. The jungle had once been threaded by the trails of loggers and chicleros, seeking mahogany and chicle trees for the international market. Now there were no such trails because there were no such trees left. This was not the forest primeval. It was a human artifact, like the genetically altered carbon dioxide gobblers that stood in industrial ranks across the synthetic forests of Europe and North America. These trees were the carpetbaggers of an ecological society smashed and in disarray. Thorn, mesquite, cabbage palm, winding lianas. They had swallowed whole towns, even in places whole oil refineries. Swollen populations of parrots and monkeys, deprived of their natural predators, made nights miserable. The spook took constant satellite checks of his position and was in no danger of losing his way. He was not having any fun. Disposing of the rogue humanitarian had been too easy to enjoy. His destination was the sinister hacienda of the 20th century American millionaire John Augustus Owens, now the headquarters of the Mayan Brain Trust. The stuccoed roof combs of the Tikal pyramids were visible from treetops 30 miles away. The spook recognized the layout of the resurgent city from satellite photographs. He traveled till dark and spent the night in the decaying church of an overgrown village. In the morning, he killed his 2 mules and set out on foot. The jungle outside Tikal was full of hunters' trails. A mile outside the city, the spook was captured by 2 sentries armed with obsidian-studded clubs and late 20th century automatic rifles. His guards looked too tall to be actual Mayans. They were probably outside recruits rather than the indigenous Guatemalan Indians who made up the core of the city's population. They spoke only Maya, mixed with distorted Spanish. With the help of his computer, the spook began eagerly sucking in the language, meanwhile complaining plaintively in English. The veil gave a talent for languages. He had already learned and forgotten over a dozen. His arms were bound behind him, and he was searched for weapons, but not otherwise harmed. His captors marched through a suburban complex of thatched houses, cornfields, and small gardens. Turkeys scratched and gobbled underfoot. He was turned over to the theocrats in an elaborate wooden office at the foot of one of the secondary pyramids. There he was interrogated by a priest who put aside a headdress and jade lip plug to assume the careful colorlessness of a bureaucrat. The priest's English was excellent, and his manner had that ingrained remoteness and casual assumption of total power that only a long acquaintance with industrial-scale power structures could breed. The spook slipped easily into the expected responses. With immediate success, he posed as a defector from the synthesis in search of the so-called human values. that the synthesis and the zybatseries had dismissed as obsolete. He was escorted up the pyramid's limestone stairs and imprisoned near the apex in a small but airy stone cell. His integration into Mayan society, he was told, would come only when he had emptied himself of old falsehoods and was cleansed and reborn. In the meantime, he would be taught the language. He was instructed to watch the daily life of the city and to expect a vision. The cell's barred windows provided a splendid view of Tikal. Ceremonies were carried out every day on the largest temple pyramid. Priests climbed like sleepwalkers up its steep stairs, and stone cauldrons sent black threads of smoke rising into the pitiless Guatemalan sky. Tikal held almost 50,000 people, a tremendous number for a pre-industrial city. At dawn, water glittered from a hand-dug limestone reservoir east of the city. At dusk, the sun set in the jungle beyond a sacred cenote, or sacrificial well. About 100 yards from the cenote was a small but elaborate stone pyramid, closely guarded by men with rifles, which had been erected over the bomb-proof shelter of the American millionaire Owens. When the spook craned his neck and peered through the stone bars, he could see the entrances and exits there of the city's highest-ranking priests. The cell went to work on him the first day. The combination of his spook training, the veil, and his computer protected him, but he observed the techniques with interest. During the day, he was hit with occasional blasts of subsonics, which bypassed the ear and dug right into the nervous system, provoking disorientation and fear. At night, hidden speakers used hypnagogic indoctrination techniques, peaking around 3 a.m. when biorhythmic resistance was lowest. Mornings and evenings, priests chanted aloud at the temple's summit, using a mantra-like repetition as old as humanity itself. Combined with the mild sensory deprivation of the chamber, its effect was powerful. After 2 weeks of this treatment, the spook found himself chanting his language lessons aloud with an ease that seemed magical. In the 3rd week, they began drugging his food. When things began to trail and pattern about 2 hours after lunch, the spook realized he was not facing the usual vibratory thrill of subsonics, but a powerful dose of psilocybin. Psychedelics were not the spook's drugs of choice, but he rode out the dose with much difficulty. The peyote next day was considerably harder. He could taste its bitter alkaloids in his tortillas and black beans, but he ate it all anyway, suspecting that his intake and output were monitored. The day crawled by with spasms of nausea alternating with elation states that made him feel his pores were bleeding spines. He peaked sometime after sunset when the city gathered by torchlight to watch 2 young women in white robes plummet fearlessly from a stone catafalque into the cold, green depths of the sacred well. He could almost taste the chill green limestone water in his own mouth as the drugged girls quietly drowned. In the 4th and 5th weeks, his diet of native psychedelics was cut back. He was acculturated by being escorted around the city by 2 young priestesses of his own apparent age. They rounded out the subliminal language lessons and began to introduce him to the resurgence's carefully crafted theology. By now, a normal man would have been sufficiently pulverized to cling to them like a child. It had been a severe ordeal, even for the spook, and he sometimes had to struggle against the urge to rip both priestesses to pieces like a pair of tangerines. Halfway through his 2nd month, he was put to work on probation in the cornfields and allowed to sleep in a hammock in a thatched house. 2 other recruits shared the hut, where they struggled to reintegrate their shattered psyches along approved cultural lines. The spook didn't like being cooped up with them. They were so broken up that there was nothing left for him to pick up on. He was tempted to creep out at night, ambush a couple of priests and break them up just to get a healthy flow of disintegrative paranoia going. But he bided his time. It was a tough assignment. The power elite's consumption of drugs had accustomed them to psychotomimetic states, and if he used his implanted schizophrenic weaponry prematurely, he might actually reinforce the local paradigm. Instead, he began to plan an assault on the millionaire's bunker. Presumably, most of the arsenal of the Predator Saint was still intact. Cultured plague germs, chemical agents, possibly even a privately owned warhead or two. The more he thought about it, the more tempted he was to simply murder the entire colony. It would save him a lot of grief. On the night of the next full moon, he was allowed to attend a sacrifice. The rainy season was due, and it was necessary to coax the rain gods with the death of 4 children. The children were drugged with mushrooms and adorned with flint and jade and thickly embroidered robes. Pepper was blown into their eyes to evoke the rain tears of sympathetic magic, and they were escorted to the edge of the catafalque. Drums and flutes and a chanted litany combined with the moonlight and torchlight to throw an intensely hypnotic ambiance over the worshippers. The air reeked of copal incense, and to the spook's empathic senses it seemed as thick as cheese. He let himself soak into the crowd, and it felt wonderful. It was the first time he'd had any fun in ages. A high-ranking priestess, weighted down with armlets and a towering feathered headdress, paced slowly along the front lines of the crowd, distributing ladles of fermented balsh from a jug. The spook shuffled forward for his share. There was something very odd about the priestess. At first, he thought she was just blasted on psychedelics, but her eyes were clear. She held out the ladle for him to sip, and when his fingers touched hers, she looked into his face and screamed. Suddenly, he knew what was wrong. "Eugenia!" he gasped. She was another spook. She went for him. There was nothing elegant about the hand-to-hand combat techniques of spooks. The martial arts, with their emphasis on calmness and control, didn't work for operatives, only partly conscious to begin with. Instead, ingrained conditioning simply stripped them down into screaming, clawing, adrenaline-crazed maniacs, impervious to pain. The spook felt murderous hysteria rising up within him. To stand and fight was certain death. His only hope was to escape into the crowd. But as he fended off the woman's rush, strong hands were already seizing him. Snarling, he broke free, spinning toward the lip of the broad edge of the sacred well, then turned, looked. Torches, ugly fear, a crazed face, the plumes of warriors nearing, the clack of automatic rifles, no time for a rational decision. Pure intention, then. He turned and threw himself headfirst into the wide, dank, empty gloom of the sacred well. The water was a hard shock. He floated on his back, rubbing the sting of an impact from his face. The water was thready with filaments of algae. A fish nibbled his bare leg beneath his cotton shirt. He knew all too well what it ate. He looked at the cenote walls. No hope there. They were as smooth as glass, as smooth as if they had been fused with lasers or fireball blasted. Time passed. A white form came plummeting downward, belly flopping into the water with a lethal smack. They were sacrificing the children. Something grabbed his foot and pulled him under. Water filled his nose. He was too busy choking to fight his way free. He was pulled down into the blackness. Water seared his lungs, and he passed out. The spook awoke in a straitjacket and looked up at a ceiling of creamy antiseptic white. He was in a hospital bed. He moved his head on the pillow and realized that his scalp had been shaved. To his left, an antique monitor registered his pulse and breathing. He felt awful. He waited for his computer to whisper something and realized that it was gone. Rather than feeling its loss, however, he felt somehow repulsively whole. His brain ached like an overstuffed stomach. From his right, he heard faint, harsh breathing. He twisted his head to look. Sprawled on a waterbed was a withered, naked old man, cyborged into a Medusa complex of life support machinery. A few locks of colorless hair clung to the old man's age-spotted scalp, and his sunken, sharp-nosed face had the look of long-forgotten cruelty. An EEG registered a few flickers of comatose delta waves from the hindbrain. It was John August Owens. The sound of sandals on stone. It was the female spook. "Welcome to the Hacienda Maya, Eugene." He stirred feebly in his straitjacket, trying to pick up her vibrations. It was like trying to swim in air. With growing panic, he realized that his paradigmatic empathy was gone. "What in hell?" "You're whole again, Eugene. It feels strange, doesn't it? After all those years of being a junkyard of other people's feelings, can you remember your real name yet? That's an important first step. Try." "You're a traitor." His head weighed 10 tons. He sank back into the pillow, feeling too stupid even to regret his indiscretion. Tattered remnants of his spook training said he ought to flatter her. "My real name," she said precisely, "was Anatolia Zhukova, and I was sentenced to corrective education by the Brezhnevograd People's Zaibatsery. You were a dissident or so-called criminal of some kind also, before the veil robbed you of your personality. Most of our top people here are from orbit, Eugene. We're not the stupid Terran cultists you were led to believe. Who hired you, anyway? Yamato Corporation? Fleischer S.A.? Don't waste your time." She smiled. "You'll come around. You're human now, and the resurgence is humanity's brightest hope. Look." She held up a glass flask. Inside it, something like a threaded, cloudy film floated slowly in a yellowish plasma. It seemed to squirm. "We took this out of your head, Eugene." He gasped. "The veil." "Yes, the veil. It's been riding on the top of your cortex for God knows how long now, breaking you up, keeping you fluid, robbing you of your personality. You were nothing better than a psychopath in harness." He closed his eyes, stunned. She said, "We understand veil technology here, Eugene. We use it ourselves sometimes on sacrificial victims. They can emerge from the well touched by the gods. Troublemakers turned divinely into saints. It fits in well with the old Mayan traditions of trepanation, a triumph of social engineering, really. They're very competent here. They managed to capture me without knowing anything about the spook apparat, but rumors." "You tried to take them out?" "Yes, they caught me alive and won me over. And even without the veil, I have enough perception left to tell a spook when I see one." Again, she smiled. "I was faking mania when I attacked you. I only knew you had to be stopped at any cost. I could have ripped you apart. Then, yes, but now you've lost your maniac phase, and we've killed your implanted weapons. Cloned bacteria producing schizophrenic toxins in your sinuses. Altered sweat glands oozing emotional hormones. Nasty, but you're safe now. You're nothing more or less than a normal human being." He consulted his interior state. His brain felt like a dinosaur's. Do people really feel like this? She touched his cheek. "You haven't begun to feel. Wait until you've lived with us a while, seen the plans we've made, in the finest traditions of the Predator Saints." She looked reverently at the machine-pumped corpse across the room. Overpopulation, Eugene. That's what ruined us. The saints took the moral effort of genocide upon themselves. Now the resurgents have taken up the challenge of building a stable society without the dehumanizing technology that has always inevitably been turned against us. The Mayans had the right idea: a civilization of social stability, ecstatic communion with the Godhead, and a firm appreciation of the cheapness of human life. They simply didn't go far enough. They didn't kill enough people to keep their population in check. With a few small changes in the Mayan theology, we have brought the whole system into balance. It's a balance that will outlast the synthesis by centuries. You think primitives armed with stone knives can triumph over the industrialized world? She looked at him pityingly. Don't be naive. Industry really belongs in space, where there's room and raw materials, not in a biosphere. Already, the Zybatsaries are years ahead of Earth in every major field. The Earth's industrial cartels are so drained of energy and resources trying to clean up the mess they inherited that they can't even handle their own industrial espionage. And the resurgent elite is armed to the teeth with the weaponry and the spiritual inheritance of the predator saints. John Augustus Owens dug the cenote of Tikal with a low-yield neutron bomb. And we own stores of 20th century binary nerve gas that we could smuggle if we wanted into Washington or Kyoto or Kiev. No, as long as the elite exists, the synthetics can't dare to attack us head on, and we intend to go on protecting this society until its rivals are driven into space, where they belong. And now, you and I, together, can avert the threat of paradigmatic attack. There'll be others, he said. We've co-opted every attack made upon us. People want to live real lives, Eugene, to feel and breathe and love and be of simple human worth. They want to be something more than flies in a cybernetic web. They want something realer than empty pleasures and the luxury of a Zaibatsu can world. Listen, Eugene, I'm the only person who has ever put on the Spook's veil and then returned to humanity, to a thinking, feeling, genuine life. We can understand each other. The Spook considered this. It was frightening and bizarre to be rationally thinking on his own without a computer helping to manage his stream of consciousness. He hadn't realized how stiff and painful thinking was. The weight of consciousness had crushed the intuitive powers that the veil had once set free. He said, incredulously, "You think we could understand each other? By ourselves?" "Yes," she said. "You don't know how much I've needed it." The Spook twitched in his straitjacket. There was a roaring in his head. Half-smothered segments of his mind were flaming like blown coals back into blazing life. "Wait!" he shouted. "Wait!" He had remembered his name, and with it, what he was. Outside Replicon's Washington headquarters, snow was sifting over the altered evergreens. The head of security leaned back in his chair, fiddling with his light pen. "You've changed, Eugene." The Spook shrugged. "You mean the skin? The Zybatsary apparat can deal with that. I'm dead tired of this body form anyway." "No, it's something else. Of course, I was robbed of the veil." He smiled flatly. To continue, once the traitress and I had become lovers, I was able to discover the location and guard codes of the nerve gas armaments. Immediately thereafter, I faked an emergency and released the chemical agents within the sealed bunker. They had all sought safety there, so their own ventilation system destroyed all but 2 of them. Those 2 I hunted down and shot later the same night. Whether the cyborg Owens died or not is a matter of definition. You won the woman's trust? No, that would have taken too long. I simply tortured her until she broke. Again, he smiled. Now the synthesis can move in and dominate the Mayan population, as you would any other pre-industrial culture. A few transistor radios will knock the whole flimsy structure over like a deck of cards. You have our thanks, said the chief, and my personal congratulations. Save it, said the spook. Once I've faded back into the shadows under the veil, I'll forget all this anyway. I'll forget that my name is Simpson. I'll forget that I am the mass murderer responsible for the explosion of the Leyland Zybatsary and the death of 8,000 orbiters. By any standards, I'm a deadly hazard to society who fully deserves to be psychically destroyed. He fixed the man with a cold, controlled, and feral grin. And I face my own destruction happily, because now I've seen life from both sides of the veil. Because now I know for sure what I've always suspected. Being human just isn't enough fun. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.